Hello, and thank you for joining us today. This is Steve Patrick. I'm the Executive Director at the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions, and we're excited to welcome you to our webinar, Collective Impact for Opportunity Youth. Today, we're going to discuss how a collective impact approach is a promising way for communities to work together to re-engage opportunity youth, often referred to as disconnected youth, on pathways to success in their life and career. I am joined by FSG's Faye Hanley-Brown and two panelists, Adria Steinberg, Vice President from Jobs for the Future, and Stacy Holland, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Philadelphia Youth Network, the backbone organization for the country's leading collective impact effort for opportunity youth, Project U-Turn. They're going to join us for a discussion about why collective impact is a relevant approach for opportunity youth and what communities can do to launch a collective impact effort to improve outcomes for their local young people. While we will specifically discuss the recent Collective Impact for Opportunity Youth paper that was produced by FSG with support from the Gates and Annie E. Casey Foundation, it's important to recognize that while the work of reconnecting opportunity youth is incredibly difficult, there is unprecedented momentum and a lot of new resources for those who work in this field. So a lot of this momentum is due to the recent work of the White House Council for Community Solutions, which focused on and in many ways renamed opportunity youth. And the White House Council developed a host of products and tools, and we just wanted to mention that if you visit their website, you'll find a range of papers and a return on investment study and a whole host of other good resources built around that White House Council's emphasis on opportunity youth. So we encourage everyone to look at those reports and look at the White House Council's final recommendations to the President, which align with this collective impact approach. Our work at the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions also helps to build on this new momentum and will lift up stories of success and community collaboration related to opportunity youth, while also launching a new national funding collaborative that focuses on building evidence of success for collective impact. So we're looking forward to a good conversation with our panelists, and we will be sure to leave time for Q&A. You can enter your questions at any time by typing your questions into the box on the lower left part of your screen. We will not be able to answer all the questions, but we will try to get to as many as possible, especially the questions that broadly reflect the themes we're seeing. We'll also answer additional questions on FSG's collective impact work following the event. We're excited to hear from you. We're also live tweeting today using hashtag collective impact. I hope you'll join us. So before I turn it over to Faye Hanley-Brown, let me just tell you a little bit more about the new Aspen Forum for Community Solutions and our work going forward. We're a relatively new, actually the newest poverty program at the Aspen Institute, and our mission is to support community collaboration, including collective impact, that enables communities to effectively address their most pressing challenges. The Forum works to accomplish this mission by pursuing 4 complementary strategies, including building awareness by documenting and lifting up stories of success, mobilizing stakeholders through knowledge and network development, removing barriers by advocating for effective policy, and last, we're really trying to catalyze investment by encouraging funder partnerships. And the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund is the first funding collaborative being developed and led by the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions. So now, without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Faye Hanley-Brown from FSG.
Thanks so much, Steve. And I'm delighted to be with you today. We have so many organizations joining us on today's webinar, which is really exciting. I wanted to start by giving a quick introduction about FSG. We're a global nonprofit, and we provide strategy consulting, evaluation, and research to clients around the world. And we were started in 2000 by Harvard professor Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, and we now work across really all sectors to help organizations to solve social problems. We've published several articles about collective impact, including our latest Stanford Social Innovation Review article, Embracing Emergence. And we also continue to learn about this important approach through our ongoing consulting and research. So many of you may be familiar with the concept of collective impact and the recent report, Collective Impact for Opportunity Youth, which is really the focus of today's webinar. This report was supported by the Gates Foundation and the Annie E. Casey Foundation and is really intended as a call to action for communities to bring together the systems and stakeholders that touch opportunity youth in order to improve outcomes for these youth. Before we jump into the discussion today with Stacy and with Adria, I'd like to take about 10 minutes just to briefly recap some of the key findings in this report and to provide some context around opportunity youth and why we see collective impact as a really powerful approach to improving the lives of these young people. So just to jump in, let's start by defining what we mean by opportunity youth. This is a term that was coined by the White House Council for Community Solutions and refers to youth between the ages of 16 and 24 who are disconnected from school and from work. Also known as disconnected youth, the term opportunity youth really reflects the optimism that these youth feel about their future, as well as the tremendous opportunity that they represent for our employers and really for our whole nation. Each year, over 1 million American youth become disconnected from the systems that were designed to educate and support them. And overall, the opportunity youth population in the United States totals 6.7 million young people, which represents really an incredible 17% of the total population of 16 to 24-year-olds in our country. It's a really significant population. While the opportunity youth population is very large, it's important to note that it is not a homogeneous group. The backgrounds of these youth and the challenges that they face vary widely. They're disproportionately from minority and low-income populations, and the majority grow up in households where the parents didn't graduate from college. Some live apart from their parents or are single parents themselves. But it's important to remember that regardless of their individual circumstances, these youth have one thing in common. They've been disconnected from any pathway leading to a productive life and career. So given how varied the opportunity youth population is, it's critical for a community to look at local data to really understand what their particular opportunity youth population looks like in order to identify the types of services and supports that these youth need. So just as an example, a population that's primarily composed of young high school dropouts that are only a few credits away from earning a high school diploma would really benefit from dropout recovery and academic acceleration to help youth to complete a GED and to bridge to post-secondary education. Whereas in a community that has a large population of youth who have been incarcerated, it'll be critical to involve the juvenile justice system to ensure that strong supports exist for youth to reconnect with school and career when they're exiting the justice system. The impact of disconnection for these youth is incredibly significant for the youth themselves, but it also carries a heavy cost to society. Opportunity youth have lower lifetime earnings and are more likely to need government support. So the average opportunity youth costs taxpayers almost $14,000 per year between the ages of 16 to 24, and a total of nearly $150,000 over the rest of their lifetime. This translates to a staggering $4.75 trillion for aggregate lifetime costs to society for the opportunity youth population. But if opportunity youth can be reconnected to school and to work, they represent a tremendous potential resource for U.S. businesses and our economy. Despite high unemployment, there are over 3 million jobs that U.S. employers are not able to fill today with qualified workers. And the research tells us that over 60% of jobs are projected to require some post-secondary education by 2018, clearly a significant increase from 40 years earlier. So really helping to break the cycle of poverty for opportunity youth presents a real resource for employers and tremendous potential savings for society. So let's take a closer look at how opportunity youth become disconnected from education or career opportunities. The pathway to education and career depicted on this slide looks very linear. And for many of us on the phone today, it probably was. For opportunity youth, however, the pathways to education and career are typically not linear. and many youth drop out of and re-enter education or the workforce multiple times during their lives. There are multiple loss points along the way, and the challenges that these youth face are myriad, including poor quality schools, involvement with juvenile justice or foster care systems, with inadequate supports or connection back to school or employment, the lack of career skills, both technical expertise and some of the softer job readiness skills, no meaningful connections to supportive adults or peers who can help them to find their pathway through, a lack of work experience or clear career pathways, or really other life circumstances that intervene. Understanding these challenges and loss points is an important step for communities as they consider how to re-engage their local youth. Given that the individual needs of opportunity youth vary greatly, it is critical to build multiple pathways for youth to reconnect to education and careers. So a 16-year-old teen mother who's dropped out of high school and is looking to finish her high school diploma and earn a credential in the medical field clearly has very different needs from a 22-year-old recent immigrant who's seeking to improve his literacy and work in the construction field. While communities must design different pathways for success for opportunity youth, our conversations with youth and with practitioners identified 4 common components that are needed to develop effective pathways. I'll touch on them briefly here, but we outline these in greater detail in the Opportunity Youth report. And these include re-engagement, so really being able to identify opportunity youth, assess their individual needs, and connect them with appropriate services and programs. Educational momentum, so really structuring education around reaching early and frequent education milestones to keep youth engaged on the path to attaining a high school degree or a GED, and ultimately a post-secondary degree or credential. Connection to career, so really using local labor market data and partnering with local employers to identify and help prepare youth for relevant employment opportunities. And finally, youth development, so really addressing the social and emotional needs of youth in order to help them to develop confidence and prepare them for the workforce. One of the key challenges in reconnecting opportunity youth is that the systems and organizations that touch these youth are highly fragmented. All of the stakeholders are acting in isolation from one another, and youth are essentially forced to navigate a maze of systems and services in order to complete their education and prepare for career. A young person may find themselves figuring out how to find the best place to take classes to complete a GED, finding tutoring or counseling support, figuring out how to secure a job, and arranging childcare for their young child. And all of this before trying to figure out what career path they're interested in and how to afford college. So what is needed is greater coordination, support, and alignment among all the players that touch opportunity youth. This includes K-12 systems, community-based organizations, the post-secondary education system, employers, the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, and others. There's really an opportunity to create a no wrong door approach to coordinated services for opportunity youth, where youth are connected with the services they need regardless of the program or system that they initially contact. Our research also underlines that this must include the authentic engagement of youth themselves to ensure that their knowledge and perspectives can inform the efficacy of the pathways and strategies that are developed. So a collective impact approach, where stakeholders come together to collaboratively identify and solve a complex social problem, is therefore particularly relevant to improving outcomes for the 6.7 million opportunity youth across our country. The 5 components of collective impact include a common agenda, so really bringing all of the key stakeholders together. These are often actors who have never sat around the table before, to develop a common agenda around improved outcomes for opportunity youth. This must take into account the local community context, including what the local opportunity youth population looks like. And it's also important to build from existing efforts and collaboration that are already targeting opportunity youth. Shared measures. So this is really around defining a small set of shared outcomes and using that data to track progress and improve practice over time. And it can include the number of youth that are reconnected, the levels of post-secondary persistence and attainment, and we'll talk more about measurement later in the conversation. We also find that collective impact efforts typically include a clear structure with a governance committee and working groups which enable continuous communication across the stakeholders, including youth themselves. This really allows for learning and the building of trust over time and enables stakeholders to coordinate so that their activities are mutually reinforcing. And finally, it's critical to have a backbone organization or dedicated capacity to guide the vision and strategy of the collaboration. Backbone organizations play critical roles, including convening and coordinating the many stakeholders that are working to support youth, facilitating data collection and learning from shared measures, and really helping to build the public will to support this population. So all of these factors, a common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone support, we found are really important for laying the foundation for communities to effectively come together around improving outcomes for Opportunity Youth. So with that brief overview, I'm excited to turn back to our panelists to really talk about their first-hand experience with collective impact and Opportunity Youth. And as Steve mentioned, we are very fortunate to have with us today Adria Steinberg, who is the Vice President at Jobs for the Future and a co-author of the Collective Impact for Opportunity Youth White Paper, and Stacey Holland, who's the co-founder and CEO of the Philadelphia Youth Network, which is the backbone organization for Project U-Turn, a comprehensive collective impact effort focused on Opportunity Youth in Philadelphia. Adria, I'd love to start with you. As someone who's been working closely with this population for many, many years, why do you see collective impact as a relevant approach for Opportunity Youth?
Well, I think about it in terms of three reasons, really. The scope and the dimensions of the Opportunity Youth population itself, which you've just been over, the barriers to opportunity they face, and the particular advantages provided by a collective impact approach. So first I would say that although it's a very large group, as you've said, it is for the most part an invisible group. It's not a designated subpopulation in any system, which means that data about how they are doing is not routinely tracked, and there's no one system that holds all the responsibility or accountability for how these young people are doing, which is all made further complicated by the fact that the population actually includes two major segments, which you alluded to before. About half of the 6.7 million haven't been in school or a stable job since the age of 16, and the other half do have some schooling and work experience and maybe even a diploma or a GED, but aren't progressing towards a credential or stable employment. So I want to emphasize that it is not for lack of ambition or trying that they end up as Opportunity Youth. There's strong evidence that young people continue to seek reconnection. We know there are long waiting lists around the country for programs such as Youth Build and others, and for strong alternative schools that districts sometimes provide that give a pathway back to education and credentials and jobs. And we know from a recent survey that the young people themselves made clear a strong desire to find pathways to employment, and they understand they will require more education and that they have a responsibility in finding these pathways themselves. But unfortunately, what they find is very limited opportunities. The three major opportunity systems in the country, which are K-12 and higher ed and workforce, are really not set up to advance this group of young adults efficiently through to a credential or a career. I mean, just to give one example, we've got, remedial or developmental ed in community colleges ends up being a gate most of these young people never get through rather than a ladder that they can climb. And young people find themselves in a situation in which they have no path back to the pipeline, to the education employment pipeline, and at best swirl among a confusing array of poorly financed adult ed or workforce training programs that are offered by a variety of different agencies or providers and often lack any special features that might help them meet the needs of young people who've experienced interruptions in their schooling and have virtually no work history to build on. So this picture of who the young people are and the at best fragmented services points to some real advantages of the collective impact approach. The issues faced by Opportunity Youth constitute actually exactly the kind of complex social problem that can benefit from key stakeholders across sectors and systems working together in new ways. They can do a lot to call attention to and fuel a sense of urgency about this population and build community-wide momentum for the work. So in other words, they can address the visibility issues. They can leverage their resources in new ways, by reallocating current resources to prioritize this population, by raising new dollars together for joint work, and by sharing in the costs of pathways that cross systems. For example, we've seen community programs share space with community colleges or share instructors in credentialing pathways. And third, in terms of mutual accountability, they can really hold themselves and one another accountable for developing partnerships and pathways that put young people back on track to family-sustaining careers. For example, we've seen school districts work with community colleges to help dropouts return not just for a high school diploma, but to begin bridging into a post-secondary pathway. And you can see the dramatic results from this kind of enhanced recovery in huge districts such as Philadelphia or New York, and very small ones such as Forest, San Juan, Alamo, and the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. We've also seen CBOs that provide initial training we've also seen CBOs that are actually the front door that often young people go through to get some initial training. We've seen them partner with employers and community colleges in creating new pipelines to career employment for young people. So those are the kinds of partnership activities they can use to drive the development of scalable and sustainable pathways that put young people into family-sustaining careers.
That's great, Adria, and I think those are really important examples of ways to create that mutual accountability that you're talking about for this population. Stacy, Project U-Turn is really one of the best examples in the country of a community taking a collective impact approach and getting to improved outcomes for this population. Can you talk a bit about the approach that you've taken in Philadelphia and the results that you've seen from this work?
Well, Philadelphia's history with mounting a collective impact strategy on behalf of Opportunity Youth actually goes back a decade. We actually grew out of some work from a very committed group of people who served on our Workforce Investment at Youth Council that were focused on out-of-school youth back in 2003. And based on their actions to increase funding and visibility for Opportunity Youth within our city, we decided to approach one of our local foundations, the William Penn Foundation, as well as we were also selected as one of the 5 cities under the Youth Transition Funders Group in early 2005. All of these actions allowed us to develop and launch the Project U campaign in 2006. So from that point until today, which is 7 years later, we've had extraordinary success in maintaining our collective impact approach. But let me describe how the collaborative came about. The first thing that you absolutely need and that we approached is that you need a cross-sector collaborative. You have to have all the key players, decision makers, or key conduits from major institutions that are able to sit at your table, including the district, local political leadership, if you can, your mayor on down, foster care, juvenile justice, youth advocates, community organizers, universities, program providers, as well as young people themselves. We came together to answer a very simple question. We wanted to know who our Opportunity Youth were and how we could build resources, how we could build services to actually re-engage these young people and move them towards a high school credential and then a post-secondary choice. Our other objective was to make sure that we could leverage and align our key resources within the city and make sure we were building a service delivery system that would actually meet the needs of our Opportunity Youth. The second thing is that we realized we had to have a backbone organization to coordinate the collaborative. So a neutral broker is a key characteristic of this organization. That organization should be less interested in taking credit and more interested in the convening and the connecting of partners to make sure that all of the objectives of the key stakeholders are being met and that you're staying on task and focusing on your dropout crisis. In Philadelphia, that role of the backbone organization is actually played by my organization, Philadelphia Youth Network. So we have the ability to align and leverage dollars across multiple systems. And as the neutral convener, you're only interested in convening, connecting, developing work plans, keeping partners informed, on track, and make sure that we're holding each other accountable. The third element is a data-driven decision-making process. You have to have high-quality data that tell you where you are presently in regards to your Opportunity Youth, and also the way to solutions. Probably the most important thing that came out of our YTFG grant was our research study called Unfulfilled Promises that was authored by Dr. Ruth Neild and Dr. Bob Belfance, which gave us a true picture of the dimensions of Philadelphia's dropout crisis and also pointed to strategies of how to address it. These data also allowed us to understand how near or how far our dropouts were from graduation, and also allowed us to shed light on the graduation rates of young people within our public care systems. And both of these proved to be extremely helpful in helping us to build momentum for our campaign. For example, we learned that at least 50% of our dropouts were older and nowhere near graduation in terms of credits earned. We know that we needed new educational approaches to meet their needs because our existing service delivery structure would not accommodate them. And when our partners representing foster care and juvenile justice learned that their young people in care were actually dropping out at a rate of 70% and 90% respectively, they then understood that they had a major stake in the issue and needed to be at this table in order to help to craft solutions. The fourth item is really consensus action plans and public accountability. You have to be able to build a strategy that the entire collaborative actually aligns around and make sure that every member of the collaborative actually has a role in making sure that you're achieving those agreed upon outcomes. We have met monthly for the last 7 years to hash out issues, review our progress, and then produce and release an annual public report that we submit to our mayor and also our Council of College and Career Success, which is appointed by our mayor to drive his education and workforce goals. The Project U-Turn Collaborative is a standing committee of this council. And the last is high-level political support. So in Philadelphia, we're extremely fortunate that our existing mayor, Mayor Nutter, has embraced the U-Turn agenda. But this didn't happen by accident. We actually began lobbying Mayor Nutter when he was a candidate, urging him to support the Dropout Recovery and Prevention campaign. So some of the successes we've had to date is since 2006, when U-Turn was launched, we've seen an increase in our high school graduation rate from 52% to 64%, which is the highest we've seen in decades. We've also built a system of new multiple pathway options that include a dozen new high schools that just focus on overage, under-credentialed young people. And we also have built an array of workforce development options so that way young people can actually attach to some type of workforce credential. We also better understand our subpopulations. We now know what's happening in our foster care system, our juvenile justice system, and young people who are pregnant and parenting. And we've also established new access points. We've created a re-engagement center at the school district, as well as where almost 12,000 young people have actually went through that system and been connected back to education, as well as an education support center at the Department of Human Services. They've been able to resolve hundreds of issues relating to young people and their educational journey in the foster care system. And most importantly, we've been able to raise and leverage over $200 million in support from government and foundation sources just to focus on our opportunity youth.
Wow. Congratulations, Stacey. That's really exciting. And obviously just great progress on a number of fronts. You identified a lot of critical components that have allowed you to be successful, not least of which is meeting monthly for 7 years, which is obviously just incredible commitment. And so just thinking about the key players that you were able to bring to the table and hold there, the role of the backbone, the data-driven decision-making process and how you're able to structure roles and the political support that you've had are all just really, really key components. And I'd love to come back to several of those because we're starting to get questions from the audience about those. You talked about how complex this work is, and clearly this is something that takes several years. Project U-Turn's been underway for 7. This is something that can be hard to measure and takes a long time to see outcomes. Adria, I'd love to turn to you to talk about that and what you've seen in terms of how you measure success and how communities can really track progress around outcomes for opportunity youth.
Okay, well, it's not for the faint of heart. I mean, the ultimate goal here is to reconnect young people to pathways that will get them to good jobs and stable, productive lives. In measuring progress along the way, it's important to look both at how well the collaborative is doing in creating or expanding opportunities and pathways, and then how well the young people themselves are faring in getting back into the opportunity pipeline and gaining those credentials and jobs. So in terms of the collaborative, to see how well they're doing in providing new pathways, they can try to measure things like whether policies or infrastructure in the key institutions are changing to be more supportive of this group of young people. Often they start with waivers, but then from waivers can you get to actual systems change. They can look at whether resources are being invested in programming for these young people and whether they are paying special attention to subgroups of the opportunity youth population that might need additional on-ramps, such as those coming out of incarceration or foster care. In terms of the young people themselves, you would want to see how many there are in pathways that have been expanded or developed through the efforts of the partners, and these pathways should meet some evidence-based criteria. You'd certainly want to see increased numbers making progress towards and earning high school and post-secondary and industry-recognized credentials, and ultimately gaining employment in career fields. So that said, I do have to add a caveat here, which is that while all of this data is key, and data is key to the visibility and to the continuous improvement and to impact, there are also issues of local capacity and data infrastructure which have to be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to talk about the evaluation really on, or measurement on two levels, one around outcomes for the youth themselves and another around essentially the systems changes. And one of the things that we found at FSG is that a new approach to evaluation is often needed in complex environments like this. And so we've recently written about developmental evaluation as a great possible approach to look at some of those systems changes that you were talking about, Adria. So we'd love now, we wanted to really reserve a good last half hour of the webinar for questions from you all, from our audience. And we've already gotten a number of really wonderful questions from folks that are on the webinar, and would encourage you to type in questions that you have in response to the great examples and ideas that Adria and Stacy have put out there. Maybe just to start, Stacy, there are a number of questions about Project U-Turn that are coming from our audience. One is about youth voice and how you make sure that you include the voice of young people in this work, ensure that the interventions are really appropriate for them. Can you talk a little bit about how Youth Voice has been engaged in Project U-Turn?
Sure, and there's actually a number of ways. The first is that we actually have youth advocates that are part of the coalition, and they've been part of the coalition from the beginning. So one of the things when you create your coalition, we actually have the same institutional members today as we did 7 years ago. And the consistency really has been because I think people see value. We included Youth Voice at the very beginning, and it comes in 3 ways. The first is that youth are a member of the collaborative. We actually then built different work plan items into the annual work plan where young people are actually going out and surveying their peers. And then every time we build an intervention, before we actually launch the intervention, we test it with multiple student groups or youth organizing groups around the city to make sure that the intervention actually resonates with the young people that we're designing it for.
That's great. One of the questions, too, around Project U-Turn for you, Stacy, is the idea of short-term wins in the early years to maintain momentum. I mean, again, you all have been at this for 7 years. Were there some short-term wins that you all had in the beginning that allowed you to maintain that momentum? How did you hold that group together for 7 years?
Yes, there were a number of things, and I think every year you have to figure out what your intermediate wins are in order for people to see progress. So you have a long-term goal, which for us is to increase the numbers of high school credentials that are being earned as well as the transition into a post-secondary choice. But in the short term, in the early years, there were several things. One, first we brought up a hotline that young people could actually call, and young people or their parents. And at the other end of that hotline was an adult who was helping them get to an option of their choosing that made sense for them. That was a huge win. And from the first week that we brought that hotline up, in the first 4 days, we had 1,500 calls. The other part is that you have to be able to communicate out those wins really quickly. So we did a really quick data study, just what we call almost a dipstick, and we were able to communicate that out to the collaborative real time. So when we started our data study, we actually sat with our researchers as we went along, and every time there was a data point that we learned about, then the collaborative came together and actually analyzed that. And then members were charged with, well, how are you going to potentially use this data within your immediate world to help improve this agenda? The key to doing that, however, is that you really have to have trust at the table, and you cannot come to that table wanting to play the blame game. So we are very, very intentional about building a trustful place that's safe and that it has to be solution-oriented. So as, for example, in the juvenile justice system, as soon as we knew that almost 90% of the young people were dropping out within 30 days of returning from placement, we automatically diagnosed what happened, and we built a solution to that very, very quickly.
That's great, and I can't underline the role of building trust more strongly. We've really seen that in many, many communities across the country, and obviously that does take time. Stacy, maybe one more for you, and then we'll switch over to Adria, but there are a lot of questions around the role of the Backbone organization in this work. And one of the specific questions that we got was, how do you choose that organization? Does it need to be, you've talked about the role of a neutral broker. Does it need to be a third party, like a consulting organization? Can it be a provider in the community? And so maybe you could talk a little bit about how Philadelphia Youth Network took on that role and what you see as the most important aspects of it.
Sure. I mean, I think the process that we went through was when we created the collaborative, there was no expectation that Philadelphia Youth Network would be the managing partner. And so we actually, as a collaborative, went through what were the characteristics that we need in order to enter into this campaign together. And so each of the stakeholders kind of outlined, before there was an FSG kind of characteristics that were laid out, we outlined almost the same exact thing. We needed someone that really was an expert in this field of out-of-school youth, that was a trusted colleague, that was a neutral broker, that really was not looking to advance their own personal organizational agenda, but really could work neutrally on behalf of the collaborative, and a place that was really flexible. And then the process that we went through is the collaborative actually chose the managing partner. And I think that's really important. So whether in your community that it might be a consulting firm, I think you will know your community best, but I would strongly encourage everyone to think about, find that organization that is neutral in nature, very flexible, and actually has some expertise in this area of opportunity youth, and they're very nimble are all critical characteristics.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense, Stacy. And we have also seen just a range of different organizations being able to play this role in communities. So as you point out, it's really more the characteristics of the organization and the role it plays in the community than it is, the organizational type or structure, if you will. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So many, many questions that we're getting now around funding and how you fund this work. Adria, would love to hear from you about your experience in using different forms of funding. I know braided funding is one of the things that we've seen a lot in communities around opportunity youth, but maybe you could speak a little bit to the funding for this work.
Sure. Well, first of all, you have to think about how to get some funding, modest funding, but some funding for the Backbone organization to have the kind of staffing and careful work that Stacy's describing. So there has to be some funding coming in that helps with that. And in the time of the Youth Transition Funders Group that Stacy was referencing, what we used was a combination really of local and national funding. We had a few national funders willing to step out and say, this is a set of key issues around the country. At the time, it was very focused really on dropouts more than this broader problem and population. And they said, this is a key problem. We will put in some modest dollars if it leverages the community to be able to also kick in some money. So there were local and community foundations that came to the table, and all of this, those funding sources together could help support the staffing and the backbone organization, and also critically some of the innovation that needs to happen, because you can do this partially through the kinds of alignment and sharing of resources I talked about, but at the end of the day, this is a population of young people who just don't have enough options. So there is some work to be done in actually some reinvention work. Ultimately, like you're saying, Faye, you do want to get to the point where there's a braiding of some of the, the funding from the various systems in the city that, have been repurposed to this end, because you can't support multiple pathways of the sort we need on soft money. The soft money really has to play a different role.
That's great. And Steve, I'd love to hear from you on this one too. I mean, clearly as a former funder just at the Gates Foundation, how do you think about funding and the role of private funding as well in this work?
Thank you for the question, Faye. As a recovering philanthropoid, I have lots of thoughts about this. So, and I think that there's a moment right now in terms of opportunities to break down some of the barriers in traditional funding streams, primarily at the federal government level, but how they reach states and localities. So there's a real momentum inside the current administration to, figure out what are the barriers to, cross-system investment in pathways and scaling up pathways for Opportunity Youth. And you see that probably most manifest in this new interagency task force on disconnected youth at the federal level that's trying to figure out how do you provide waivers that get beyond categorical funding and really fund results, particularly for Opportunity Youth. So I think there's some exciting momentum inside government and inside some of those big revenue streams. But Adria and Stacy make the right point that, to get started, you do need that backbone coordination. You need those connective tissue dollars that help to herd the larger collaborative at the local level, and that often requires, philanthropic investment. I think, we're starting to see in philanthropy some real interest in the collective impact approach and in making these kinds of investments, even though, it's not always easy to point to deliverables. And for funders who are, quote unquote, buying an outcome, it's not an easy lift to make the case for the coordinating role of backbones. I do think that is a trend that's going to pick up, but I also think that one of the most interesting things about this approach and about the cross-system, cross-sector kinds of efforts we're starting to see across the country is that it is pushing back on some of the hyper-strategic philanthropy that national funders sometimes subscribe to, and the notion that there's a single lever or a single point solution that a foundation can invest in. We're starting to see less in terms of impact and outcomes for that kind of approach. And so I think there's going to be some room in national philanthropy and especially in place-based local foundations stepping up to invest in this kind of work. So, I think the learning for philanthropy has been a steep curve, and there are real opportunities to leverage funders. And ultimately, it is not a huge lift in terms of the financing for the backbone. You can start it with some philanthropic dollars, and then you figure out as you repurpose and leverage existing revenue streams for better outcomes, there is some opportunity for sustainability beyond the need of philanthropic dollars.
Absolutely. And I think great set of points, Steve, and we've certainly seen the critical role that private philanthropy can play in both catalyzing collective impact efforts, but really importantly, supporting the infrastructure, the process for bringing the different stakeholders together, funding the backbone, funding shared measurement systems, that kind of thing. Stacey, I'd love to go to you on this as really a local practitioner that is living this every day. We've had a couple of questions around the cost of a backbone organization. So if you could speak a little bit to the the cost of Philadelphia Youth Network, and what it takes to coordinate this work. And then also a question around, the tension, if you're finding any, between, funding the coordinating function of the backbone versus mobilizing funding for the effort overall. Could you speak to those 2 points?
Yes, I would say on average, it probably costs us for the convening function probably somewhere about $175,000. But who's involved in that convening process? It's almost every member of my executive team, as well as my development staff, because once the collaborative decides to identify their priorities, then we're actually helping to raise funding for certain priorities. I'm also blending that expense with other convening and governance opportunities that I actually have within the organization. So I think people can really think creatively about how they're going to staff their backbone organization. Versus the funding for the collaborative, and I think it's really important to note that in Philadelphia, we're only successful as long as our members stay engaged and that they are also a part of the process. So part of that $175,000 are some subcontracts as well for members of the collaboratives to work on specific issues, whether it's policies, whether it's organizing youth voice, whether it's helping us think through a local agenda around how we're going to move something within our school district. We really use the gifts and talents of the people sitting around the table and try and strategize about who's best positioned to move what issue. So we just launched our second generation work plan, and it's a really diverse work plan where we each own a piece, and so you have to make sure that you're going to compensate people accordingly. And then the third part of the funding is what you actually need to build the service delivery systems and or to course correct some of the policy issues within your local area. And that funding can come about a multitude of ways. You can actually redirect existing funding, you can bring new funding into your community, or you can repurpose existing funding. When we knew that we had a really bad literacy issue within this population, we went to our workforce system and asked them to design a model that would meet a need around helping low literate learners connect to workforce training. So you can be very creative in that respect as well.
That's great. And have you felt a tension in terms of balancing the fundraising for the backbone role versus overall for the effort? Or has that been something that has not been as much of an issue in Philadelphia?
No, we've been very fortunate because we included foundations as a part of the original collaborative. Our local foundation and also the Mott Foundation nationally have been wonderful supporters in terms of funding the backbone work, and that has allowed us to actually direct our fundraising efforts to supporting other organizations and or really focusing on the direct services to young people.
Hey, can I jump back in on riffing off of Stacy a little bit on the funder question? I see some more questions.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, what we're doing at Aspen with the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund seems to align pretty well with what Stacy was talking about. So we have a funding collaborative that includes a significant number of national foundations, I think, ranging from Annie E. Casey to Gates to Bloomberg to Rockefeller and more. And it's an exciting moment where you see philanthropy starting to coalesce around a collective impact approach for Opportunity Youth. And we are hoping to invest in a set of communities where there is some existing momentum and there are some existing collaboratives. They may not be as robust as Philadelphia, and they may not have as much documented impact yet. And the resources we would put in are just a few $100,000 a year in the places where we would fund implementation grants. And really we're trying to leverage local match, and ultimately that's enough resource, we believe, for the coordinating dollars, for the connective tissue dollars. But to Adria's earlier point, the scale up of pathways comes from the public sector responding in a much more collaborative way to get to much better outcomes for Opportunity Youth. So I just wanted to mention the approach we're taking with the Aspen Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund, and while we're still raising the resources and having conversations with new national funders every day, there is some existing momentum for this work, and as we roll out selecting a set of cities to be in a learning community, to connect the dots around how you finance these pathways using public revenue streams, to really grow evidence of success for collective impact for Opportunity Youth, we will want to, figure out and share the lessons learned in real time with a much broader set of communities beyond those that we invest in and connect into this larger learning community. And we will also roll up knowledge and learning and products, lessons learned in real time, so that, increased adoption can continue, as we see a pretty steep adoption curve for this kind of approach right now in real time in communities.
That's great, Steve. Thank you. And again, just really underlining the role of private philanthropy in this work. One of the questions that we've gotten here, too, is just some of the common challenges that communities face in really effectively launching collective impact efforts for Opportunity Youth. Adria or Stacy, do you want to take that one?
Well, I can start us off. I mean, I think actually Stacy mentioned a number in her comments before, but I think going back to the fragmentation, that's a challenge in itself. Overcoming that and beginning to assemble and get at the table the set of people that can really begin to move this agenda. And in some cases, people are actually used to competing with each other. And as Stacy has pointed out, you need a lot of work to really build the trust and build, get beyond any kind of blame game or just plain old, fashion competition for funds. So there's just getting that to happen and finding the champions, finding people who really believe this is possible and can go out in front and getting some of those early wins. It's one kind of serious psychological barrier, if you will, to all this work is that people tend to think, well, maybe this is just an intractable set of problems and we can't really influence this set of problems. And you've got to get beyond that. You've got to get to people really seeing the possibilities, and getting some of those early wins is one of the ways to do that. And that will depend on having people at the table, not just because they are decision makers in some of the key systems, but because they also really believe that they can get this work done. And then, of course, as I brought up before, the data can be a barrier if you can't get your hands around it. And in some communities, that's very, very difficult to do. That just the systems aren't there for doing it, and so you have to be. It's kind of an art and a science to assemble the data to even just get your hands around what is this population, what's the size of this population, how can we really begin to track and measure what's happening as we try our various kinds of changes and interventions. And keeping track of all of that in some communities is difficult, especially without, as Stacy said, adequate funding for it.
Absolutely, Adria. I can't underline more the importance of champions in this work, and we've seen really in every example of collective impact the important role that champions play, and data as well. And in fact, Stacy, you all have put together just an extraordinary database and data management system in Philadelphia. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that looks like and what it took to build it, because as we talked about earlier, this is often a population that is invisible in our communities. That because they are disconnected from the systems that collect this data, typically it's very hard to get data around Opportunity Youth. So can you speak a little bit about what that looks like in Philadelphia?
Yes, and if I can just piggyback on Adria's last comment, the one thing I would add, and this links to the data question, is that your collaborative you have to keep young people at the center. You have to fundamentally be curious about them. You have to be aspirational for them, and that you have to be diagnostic about your data to understand who they are and what you need to build. So in Philadelphia, what we did when we became curious about our Opportunity Youth, we actually pulled together local researchers as well as members from our school district, staff, juvenile justice, and our foster care system so we could actually blend those data sets together. And I think the one thing that was really critical is that as we were going through asking the various questions about data points that came up, the collaborative was actually going through the process with our researchers. So now we actually have a group of people who are steeped in the first study. We're about to launch our second study to really figure out, well, what has happened since 2006? What's happening with our subpopulations, which we're going to dig deeper into those subpopulations this time, and that now we understand the data infrastructures of these various agencies much better, and we can work to make sure that those data systems are actually talking to each other in a very coordinated way, so that way we can answer our questions collectively.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. Well, we're coming in on the end of our hour, so I wanted to really just ask our panelists for some closing comments and advice to our webinar participants about the best way to really bring communities together around getting to outcomes for Opportunity Youth. Steve, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Well, just given the list of folks who are on this call, which is quite inspiring, and the large number of funders who have joined the webinar, I guess I would offer up one closing piece of advice, which is that I really think the power of convening that funders bring to this, that might be more important than the actual dollars. Might not be, but it could be equally as important as the actual dollars for the coordination and cross-system, cross-sector efforts. And I think using convening to help bring different partners together and then do that trust building that we know is so critical and always takes longer than you think, that's a really important role that philanthropy can play. We see some instances where foundations, in particular some community foundations or other funders like United Ways, are jumping in to actually try to play the backbone organization role in addition to playing a funding role. And I think that's interesting and exciting, and we'll see how that plays out in the coming years. But either way, foundations that are place-based that only fund in a specific state or community, they have a real leverage in connecting the dots and pulling the different systems together in an ongoing conversation, which ultimately could lead to collective impact. So that's one piece of advice. And for those who aren't funders on the call, being able to go to your trusted philanthropic partners or private sector investors, corporate funders, et cetera, and approach them about getting something started. It's worth it, I believe. I think the only way we get to impact for what Adria described as an invisible group is to make them more visible across multiple sectors, and I think that's what collective impact has to offer at the community level for Opportunity Youth.
Thank you, Steve. Adria, some last advice?
Well, I don't know about advice, but I guess I would want to just underline that it is a complex set of issues, but it is also really possible to get real traction. And I think it's important to just keep in mind how many young people are really eager to get back on track. It's just that they can't find the ways to do it. It's either the opportunities aren't there, or things aren't transparent enough, or they're just not getting the support they need. And so, as I said before, by building different kinds of partnerships in the community, you really can do a lot to lay the groundwork for the kinds of pathways that the young people are looking for. And at the end of the day, it's going to take people willing not just to align their services and resources, but also be a little bold and innovate together and maybe even invent new types of opportunities and pathways that create that momentum forward. And you can see that, it's very exciting to see that happening in some communities around the country. And I just want to applaud those efforts and urge people to not be timid when it comes to working on behalf of this population. And the young people themselves are our biggest allies in this.
Thank you, Adria. And Stacy?
Sure. Just a couple of quick points. One, we all have to recognize that reconnecting Opportunity Youth is an economic imperative for this country. So we cannot afford to have these young people left behind. The second thing I would say is in your collaborative, make sure you're aspirational and that develop a plan where you're working some quick wins along the way so your whole community can see your progress, but don't back away from the big audacious goal. Also be focused. Try and solve problems that you can actually see progress on in the immediate, because the small wins will actually turn into big systemic wins. Make sure you're patient, but urgent. You know, we have to have a fierce urgency of now. These young people actually need us to figure out the solutions within our local community. And last but not least, if I hadn't spent the last 7 years of my career using this collective impact approach, I don't think that I would have believed it, but I can confidently tell you that 1, it works, 2, if you're aspirational, and 3, everyone in your collaborative is absolutely needed. You have to make sure they're valued, and you have to make sure that their agenda is being met, because it will help a larger agenda along the way.
Thank you so much, Stacy. And I'd really like to thank everybody on the call today for joining us and for asking such thoughtful questions. I'd love to thank Steve and our co-hosts at the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions, as well as Adria and Stacy for their brilliant comments. And I think, as you all have heard, there just is a tremendous momentum around this critical population in our country. And there are real evidence of success, that taking a collective impact approach really is a way to get many, many stakeholders who touch this population to work together effectively. So it's clearly a complex challenge. It is one that no single organization can solve, but one that we truly believe that communities can solve together. So for more information on this topic and on collective impact more generally, I'd encourage you to check out FSG's website at fsg.org. There is an extensive list of resources that is in the Collective Impact for Opportunity Youth report itself. Just also want to let folks know that there is going to be a recording of this webinar along with the slides that will be available in the next day or so on fsg.org. And finally, would just like you to please help us to improve our webinars going forward by filling out the brief survey that you'll see pop up at the end of today's webinar. So that's it for our webinar today. Thank you all, and have a great day.